My name is Ashley Vandenther. I'm 29 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal felt like until I discovered my husband and sister weren't just sleeping together. They were planning to steal my dying grandmother's entire fortune. But what they didn't know was that Grandma Rose had been watching them too, and she had left me something that would destroy them both. Trust me, you need to hear this entire story because by the end, you'll understand why some secrets are worth more than money, and why the dead sometimes get the last laugh. 3 months ago, I was living what I thought was the perfect life. My art studio in downtown Portland was finally gaining recognition. My paintings were selling at local galleries, and I had just signed with a promising agent who believed in my work. Most importantly, I was married to Marcus Van Denther, a successful real estate developer who seemed to support my artistic dreams unconditionally. Marcus was everything I thought I wanted in a husband: tall, handsome, financially secure, and seemingly devoted to our marriage. He would surprise me with expensive art supplies, take me to gallery openings, and always spoke proudly about my work to his business associates. We lived in a beautiful Victorian home that he had renovated himself, complete with a converted garage that served as my art studio. But there were cracks in this perfect facade that I chose to ignore. Marcus would disappear for hours, claiming to be at construction sites or meeting with investors. His phone was always face down, and he had recently changed his passcode. When I asked about it, he laughed it off, saying he was protecting sensitive business information. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. The first real warning sign came during a family dinner at my grandmother's house. Grandma Rose had been battling stage 4 pancreatic cancer for 6 months, and these weekly dinners had become our way of spending precious time together. She was my anchor, the one person in my family who had always believed in me and my art. That particular evening, my estranged sister Victoria showed up unexpectedly. Victoria and I had barely spoken in 5 years. Not since she had tried to sabotage my first gallery showing by spreading rumors that I was using our family connections to get ahead. The truth was, our family had no connections in the art world. We were solidly middle class, and everything I had achieved was through my own hard work and talent. Victoria waltzed into Grandma Rose's dining room wearing a designer dress I knew she couldn't afford on her secretary's salary. Her auburn hair was professionally styled, and her makeup was flawless. She looked like she had stepped out of a magazine, which was suspicious considering she usually dressed conservatively for her job at a law firm. "Ashley, darling," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You look tired. Are you taking care of yourself?" I caught Marcus's eye across the table, expecting him to defend me or at least show some sign of annoyance at Victoria's passive-aggressive comment. Instead, he was staring at Victoria with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was something in his eyes, a familiarity that made my stomach twist. "Victoria, how lovely to see you," Marcus said, his voice warmer than I expected. "You look absolutely stunning." The compliment hung in the air like a poison cloud. I watched as Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly, and she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture that seemed almost intimate. Grandma Rose, despite her illness, was still sharp as a tack. She watched this exchange with narrowed eyes, her weathered hands gripping her teacup so tightly her knuckles were white. She had always been protective of me, especially when it came to Victoria's jealous behavior. "Victoria," Grandma Rose said, her voice cutting through the tension, "what brings you here tonight? You haven't visited in months." Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment. "I wanted to spend time with you, Grandma. I know you're not well, and I thought it was important to be here for family." The word family sounded hollow coming from her lips. Victoria had never cared about family when it didn't serve her interests. She had missed Christmas last year, claiming she had to work, but I later found out through mutual friends that she had gone to Cabo with some mysterious boyfriend she refused to introduce to anyone. Throughout dinner, I noticed more subtle interactions between Marcus and Victoria. The way his hand lingered when he passed her the salt. The way she laughed just a little too loudly at his jokes. The way they both seemed to know things about each other that I didn't. When Marcus excused himself to take a business call, Victoria immediately became more animated, talking about her job at the law firm and how she was learning so much about estate planning and inheritance law. She kept glancing toward the hallway where Marcus had gone, as if she was performing for an audience of one. "It's fascinating how complex these things can be," Victoria said, her eyes gleaming. "Especially when there are questions about mental competency or undue influence. There are so many ways a will can be contested." Grandma Rose's fork clattered against her plate. "What exactly are you suggesting, Victoria?" Victoria's face flushed red. "Nothing, Grandma. I'm just saying that it's important to make sure everything is properly documented, for everyone's protection." The conversation felt loaded with meaning I couldn't grasp. Why was Victoria suddenly interested in inheritance law? And why did she keep looking toward the hallway where Marcus was presumably on his phone call? When Marcus returned, he seemed agitated. "Sorry about that," he said, sliding back into his seat. "Crisis at one of the job sites." But I noticed he wasn't looking at me when he said it. His eyes were on Victoria, and she was nodding slightly, as if they had shared some kind of understanding. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of awkward small talk and loaded glances. When we finally left, Marcus was unusually quiet during the drive home. He kept checking his phone at red lights, and I could see the glow of text messages lighting up his face. "Is everything okay?" I asked as we pulled into our driveway. "Just work stuff," he said, but his voice was tight. "You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. Marcus had never been secretive about his work before. He usually enjoyed telling me about his projects, the challenges he faced, the difficult clients he had to manage. This new secrecy was unsettling. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Marcus slept beside me. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, the way you can sense a storm coming even when the sky is still clear. The interactions between Marcus and Victoria replayed in my mind like a movie I couldn't turn off. I thought about the way Victoria had looked at Marcus, and the way he had complimented her appearance. I thought about her sudden interest in inheritance law, and her pointed comments about mental competency. Most of all, I thought about the secretive text messages, and the way Marcus had been pulling away from me over the past few months. Sleep finally came, but it was filled with nightmares of betrayal and loss. The next morning, Marcus left early for a job site meeting that he claimed would last all day. I decided to visit Grandma Rose, hoping to clear my head and maybe get some insight into Victoria's strange behavior the night before. I found Grandma Rose in her garden, tending to her roses despite her illness. She had always said that gardening kept her connected to life, even when death was knocking at her door. She looked frail in the morning light, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Ashley, dear," she said, setting down her pruning shears. "I was hoping you would come by." We sat on her porch swing, and I could see she had something on her mind. Grandma Rose had never been one to beat around the bush. "Victoria's behavior last night was troubling," she said without preamble, "and your husband's reaction to her was even more so." I felt my cheeks burn. "What do you mean?" "I've been around for 83 years, Ashley. I know what attraction looks like, and I know what secrets look like. There's something going on between those two." The words hit me like a physical blow. Hearing my suspicions voiced by someone else made them feel more real, more dangerous. "You think Marcus and Victoria are—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "I think you need to be very careful," Grandma Rose said, taking my hand in her weathered one. "And I think you need to know something about my will." My heart stopped. "Grandma, we don't need to talk about—" "Yes, we do." Her voice was firm. "Victoria's sudden interest in inheritance law isn't coincidental. I've been having my attorney look into some things, and I don't like what I'm finding." She told me that she had recently discovered that someone had been making inquiries about her estate, trying to find out details about her will and her assets. The inquiries had come through Victoria's law firm, but they weren't being made by Victoria herself. They were being made by someone with financial expertise, someone who knew how to navigate complex estate planning. "Someone like Marcus," Grandma Rose said quietly. The porch swing creaked as we sat in silence, processing the implications. If Marcus and Victoria were working together to manipulate Grandma Rose's will, then my marriage was a lie, and my sister was even more treacherous than I had imagined. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Grandma Rose smiled, and for a moment I saw the fierce woman she had been before illness weakened her body. "I'm going to protect the people I love," she said, "and I'm going to make sure that greed doesn't win." She wouldn't tell me exactly what she meant, but she made me promise to be careful and to watch for signs of deception. She also made me promise to keep our conversation secret, especially from Marcus. As I drove home that afternoon, my mind was spinning. If Grandma Rose was right, then everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. Marcus wasn't the loving husband I thought he was. He was a calculating manipulator who had targeted me to get access to my family's money. And Victoria wasn't just a jealous sister. She was a co-conspirator in a plan to steal from our dying grandmother. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car for a long time, trying to process it all. The Victorian house that had once felt like a sanctuary now looked like a prison. The windows seemed to stare down at me like accusing eyes, and I wondered how many lies had been told within those walls. When I finally went inside, I found Marcus in the Kit Van Denther cooking dinner. He looked up and smiled. The same warm smile that had made me fall in love with him 3 years ago. "Hey, beautiful," he said, crossing the room to kiss me. "How was your day?" For a moment, I almost forgot my suspicions. Marcus could be so charming when he wanted to be, but then I noticed his phone on the counter, face down as always, and I remembered the text messages from the night before. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. "How was the job site?" "Complicated," he said, turning back to the stove. "But we're making progress." More lies. I could hear them now, the carefully constructed evasions and half-truths that I had been accepting without question. How long had this been going on? How long had I been living with a stranger? That night, after Marcus fell asleep, I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I was going to uncover whatever plot Marcus and Victoria had hatched, and I was going to protect my grandmother from their greed. I started by looking through Marcus's things while he slept. His phone was locked, but I found a burner phone hidden in his sock drawer. When I turned it on, I saw dozens of text messages from a contact labeled V. The messages were a mixture of romantic declarations and strategic planning. Victoria and Marcus had been having an affair for 8 months. They had been meeting at expensive hotels, taking weekend trips together, and planning a future that didn't include me. But the worst part was discovering that they had been plotting to manipulate Grandma Rose's will. Victoria had been using her access to the law firm's resources to research estate planning loopholes, while Marcus had been using his financial expertise to identify ways to maximize their inheritance. They had even discussed ways to isolate Grandma Rose from me, to make her question my motives and my mental state. Victoria had been feeding her lies about my marriage, suggesting that I was unstable and that Marcus was considering leaving me. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated that I felt physically sick. I ran to the bathroom and vomited, my body rejecting the reality of what I had discovered. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back at me. The woman I had been, trusting, naive, optimistic, was gone. In her place was someone harder. Someone who had been forced to confront the reality of human greed and deception. I returned to bed and lay awake until dawn, staring at the man who had been sharing my bed while plotting my destruction. Marcus slept peacefully, his face serene and innocent in the moonlight. If I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes, I never would have believed him capable of such betrayal. But now I knew the truth, and I was going to use that knowledge to destroy them both. The war had begun, and they didn't even know it yet. The next 3 weeks were the most difficult of my life. I had to pretend everything was normal while secretly investigating the depth of Marcus and Victoria's betrayal. Every morning, I woke up next to a man who was planning my destruction, and every evening, I smiled and acted like the loving wife he expected me to be. But I wasn't passive in my deception. I was gathering evidence, building a case, and preparing for war. My first step was to hire a private investigator. I chose someone Marcus would never suspect, a middle-aged woman named Detective Patricia Mills, who specialized in matrimonial investigations. She was recommended by my art gallery owner, who had gone through a messy divorce the year before. Patricia was exactly what I needed: professional, discreet, and utterly ruthless in her pursuit of the truth. When I showed her the text messages I had photographed from Marcus's burner phone, her expression hardened. "This is more than just an affair," she said, studying the messages. "This is conspiracy to commit fraud. Your husband and sister are planning to steal from a dying woman." Patricia explained that what Marcus and Victoria were attempting was called inheritance hijacking, a sophisticated form of elder fraud that involved manipulating vulnerable elderly people into changing their wills. It was a felony that could result in serious prison time. "The good news," Patricia said, "is that they're being sloppy. Criminals always think they're smarter than they are, and these two are documenting everything. We just need to get more evidence." Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia worked her magic. She followed Marcus and Victoria to their secret meetings, photographed them entering and leaving hotels together, and even managed to get audio recordings of some of their conversations. The recordings were devastating. Not only did they confirm the affair, but they also revealed the full scope of their plan to manipulate Grandma Rose's will. Victoria had been using her position at the law firm to research ways to have wills contested, while Marcus had been using his financial connections to identify assets that could be hidden or transferred. They had even discussed ways to accelerate Grandma Rose's death, talking about how stress could worsen her condition and how they could create situations that would weaken her resolve. The callousness of their conversations made me physically ill. But the most shocking revelation came in a recording Patricia made of them meeting at an expensive restaurant downtown. Victoria was bragging about how she had been manipulating Grandma Rose's medication schedule, giving her pills that made her confused and disoriented during visits. "She's already starting to doubt herself," Victoria said, her voice filled with cruel satisfaction. "Yesterday, she asked me 3 times if she had already told me about changing her will. I told her she was getting forgetful, that maybe she should consider letting Marcus help her manage her finances." Marcus laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "You're brilliant, babe. Once we get power of attorney, we can make sure everything goes exactly as planned." "And Ashley?" Victoria asked. "Ashley will be devastated, of course. But she'll get over it. She always does. She's weak, just like she's always been." The word weak hit me like a slap. Is that really how Marcus saw me? As a weak, pathetic woman who would simply accept whatever happened to her? That night, I stood in my art studio, surrounded by paintings that suddenly seemed naive and childish. I had been painting scenes of happiness and hope, completely oblivious to the darkness that was consuming my life. But as I looked at my work, I realized something important. I wasn't weak. I was an artist, and artists see things that others miss. Artists understand that beauty and ugliness often exist in the same space. I picked up my brush and began to paint. But instead of the gentle landscapes I usually created, I found myself painting something darker, more complex. I painted betrayal and revenge, love and hate intertwined like lovers in a dance. The painting that emerged was disturbing and beautiful, a reflection of the transformation I was undergoing. While I was discovering my own strength, Patricia was uncovering even more damaging evidence. She had managed to access Victoria's computer at the law firm and found files that revealed the full scope of their plan. They had been researching Grandma Rose's assets for months, identifying everything from her house and investments to her jewelry and art collection. They had even found out about accounts that I didn't know existed, including a trust fund that had been set up for my education but never used. The total value of Grandma Rose's estate was staggering. Over $2 million. No wonder Marcus and Victoria were willing to risk everything to get their hands on it. But Patricia also discovered something else. Grandma Rose had been fighting back. "Your grandmother is sharper than they think," Patricia told me during one of our secret meetings. "She's been meeting with her attorney regularly, and she's been asking a lot of questions about estate planning and fraud prevention." Patricia had managed to establish a relationship with Grandma Rose's attorney, Harold Zimmerman, who was deeply concerned about the situation. Harold had been representing the family for 20 years, and he knew Victoria's character well enough to be suspicious of her sudden interest in inheritance law. Mr. Zimmerman has been documenting everything, Patricia explained. Every suspicious interaction, every attempt to manipulate your grandmother, every inconsistency in Victoria's story. He's building a case for elder abuse. The fact that Grandma Rose and Harold were working together gave me hope. I wasn't fighting this battle alone. But the most shocking discovery came when Patricia managed to access Marcus's business records. She found evidence that he had been embezzling money from his construction company to fund his affair with Victoria. The expensive hotels, the designer clothes, the jewelry, it was all being paid for with stolen money. Your husband is in deep financial trouble, Patricia explained. His company is basically bankrupt, and he's been using client funds to cover his expenses. If this comes out, he'll lose everything and probably go to prison. Suddenly, everything made sense. Marcus wasn't just after Grandma Rose's money because he was greedy. He was desperate. He needed that inheritance to cover his debts and avoid criminal prosecution. Victoria wasn't just a willing accomplice. She was his only hope of escaping the consequences of his financial crimes. This knowledge gave me power. I realized that I didn't just have evidence of their affair and their plot against Grandma Rose. I had evidence of multiple felonies that could destroy them both. But I also realized that I was in danger. Desperate people do desperate things, and if Marcus discovered that I knew about his crimes, he might try to silence me permanently. Patricia seemed to read my thoughts. You need to be very careful, she said. People have killed for less than $2 million. If they realize you're onto them, they might try to eliminate you. The idea that Marcus might try to hurt me physically seemed impossible. But then I remembered the cold laughter in his voice when he talked about my reaction to their betrayal. This wasn't the man I had married. This was a stranger who was capable of things I couldn't imagine. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to visit Grandma Rose and tell her everything I had discovered. She deserved to know the truth, and together we could figure out how to protect her assets and bring Marcus and Victoria to justice. But first, I had to make sure I was safe. I packed a bag with essential items and hid it in my art studio. I gave Patricia a copy of all the evidence we had gathered, with instructions to go to the police if anything happened to me. I also wrote a letter explaining everything, which I left with my art gallery owner in a sealed envelope. The next morning, Marcus left for another job site meeting that I knew was actually a rendezvous with Victoria. As soon as his car disappeared down the street, I drove to Grandma Rose's house. I found her in her garden again, but she looked frailer than ever. The cancer was progressing quickly, and I could see the pain in her eyes despite her efforts to hide it. "Ashley, dear," she said, struggling to stand. "I was hoping you would come." I helped her to the porch swing, and we sat together in the morning sun. The roses were blooming beautifully, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. It seemed wrong that such beauty could exist in the midst of so much ugliness. "Grandma," I said, taking her hand, "I need to tell you something important. It's about Marcus and Victoria." Her grip tightened on my hand. "I know, dear. I've been waiting for you to figure it out." She had known all along. While I had been blind to the betrayal happening right under my nose, Grandma Rose had been watching and waiting for me to discover the truth. "How long have you known?" I asked. "About the affair?" 3 months. About the plan to steal from me? About 6 weeks. She explained that she had hired her own investigator, a retired police detective who had been watching Marcus and Victoria for months. She had also been working with Harold Zimmerman to create a plan that would protect her assets and expose their crimes. "But why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because you needed to discover it yourself," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "If I had told you, you would have confronted them directly, and they would have found a way to cover their tracks. This way, we have evidence of their crimes, and we can make sure they face justice." Grandma Rose had been playing a long game, allowing Marcus and Victoria to believe they were manipulating her while actually gathering evidence of their fraud. She had been documenting every interaction, recording conversations, and building a case that would destroy them both. What happens now? I asked. Now we spring the trap, she said, and I saw the same fierce determination in her eyes that I had seen weeks before. But first, you need to know about the real will. She led me inside to her study, where she opened a safe I had never seen before. Inside were documents that would change everything. This is my real will, she said, handing me a thick folder. Harold and I have been working on it for months. Victoria and Marcus think they know what's in my will, but they're wrong. The document was complex, but as I read through it, I began to understand the brilliance of Grandma Rose's plan. She had created a series of conditions and triggers that would activate if anyone tried to contest the will or if there was evidence of fraud or manipulation. The most important provision was something called an integrity clause. If any beneficiary was found to have engaged in fraud, elder abuse, or any other criminal activity related to the estate, they would be completely disinherited, and their portion would go to charity. But there was more. If the integrity clause was triggered, the affected beneficiary would also be liable for all legal costs and damages, potentially costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars. Victoria and Marcus think they're so smart, Grandma Rose said, her voice filled with satisfaction. They have no idea that every move they've made has been pushing them toward complete ruin. As I read through the will, I realized that Grandma Rose had been thinking several steps ahead of her would-be manipulators. She had anticipated their moves and created consequences that would not only prevent them from stealing from her, but would also ensure they faced serious legal and financial consequences. There's something else, Grandma Rose said, pulling out another document. I've been working with Harold to create a foundation in your name. When I die, the majority of my assets will go to this foundation, which will support young artists like yourself. The foundation was called the Rose Van Denther Foundation for Emerging Artists, and it was designed to provide grants and scholarships to artists who were struggling to establish their careers. It was everything I had ever dreamed of, and more. But Grandma, I said, tears streaming down my face, I can't accept this. It's too much. You're not accepting it, she said firmly. You're earning it. You're the only one in this family who has never asked me for money, never expected an inheritance, never tried to manipulate me. You're the only one who loves me for who I am, not for what I have. We spent the rest of the day going over the details of the plan. The will would be read in 2 weeks, immediately after Grandma Rose's scheduled surgery. Harold would be handling the proceedings, and he would make sure that Marcus and Victoria were present when their crimes were exposed. What about the evidence Patricia and I have gathered? I asked. We'll turn it over to the police immediately after the will reading, Grandma Rose said. Let them think they've won. Let them celebrate their victory, and then we'll destroy them. As I prepared to leave, Grandma Rose gave me one final piece of advice. Ashley, she said, what you're about to go through will be difficult. You'll be tempted to feel sorry for Marcus, to forgive him because you loved him. But remember, he never loved you. He targeted you specifically because you were my granddaughter. Your entire marriage was a lie designed to steal from me. Her words were harsh, but they were also necessary. I needed to understand that Marcus wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a predator who had manipulated me from the very beginning. That night, I returned home to find Marcus in the kitchen, cooking dinner again. He looked up and smiled, the same warm smile that no longer fooled me. Hey, beautiful, he said, crossing the room to kiss me. I missed you today. I missed you too, I lied, forcing myself to return his kiss. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized that I was no longer the weak, naive woman he thought I was. I was a warrior preparing for battle, and I was going to destroy him. The countdown to justice had begun. The 2 weeks between my conversation with Grandma Rose and the scheduled will reading were the longest of my life. I had to maintain the facade of normalcy while knowing that everything was about to explode. Every conversation with Marcus felt like a performance. Every interaction with Victoria felt like a dangerous game. But I wasn't passive during this time. I was actively preparing for war. The first thing I did was secure my own assets. With Patricia's help, I quietly transferred my personal savings to a new account at a different bank. I also documented all of my artwork, and moved my most valuable pieces to a secure storage facility. If Marcus was going to be vindictive when his crimes were exposed, I wanted to make sure he couldn't destroy my life's work. I also began preparing for the aftermath of the revelation. I knew that once Marcus and Victoria's crimes were exposed, my marriage would be over and my relationship with my sister would be permanently destroyed. I started looking for a new place to live, researching divorce attorneys, and preparing for the emotional devastation that was coming. But most importantly, I started planning my revenge. Grandma Rose had taught me that justice wasn't enough. Marcus and Victoria deserved to face legal consequences for their crimes, but they also deserved to experience the same humiliation and betrayal that they had inflicted on me. I wanted them to know what it felt like to have their entire world collapse around them. The opportunity came when Victoria called me unexpectedly one afternoon. She had never called me before. We usually only saw each other at family gatherings, so I knew something was up. "Ashley," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "I was wondering if you'd like to have lunch tomorrow. I feel like we haven't been connecting as sisters. And with Grandma Rose being so sick, I think family is more important than ever." The invitation was obviously part of their plan. They were probably worried that I was getting too close to Grandma Rose, or maybe they wanted to gauge how much I knew about their scheme. Either way, it was an opportunity to gather more evidence and possibly plant some seeds of doubt about their perfect plan. "I'd love to," I said, matching her fake enthusiasm. "Where would you like to meet?" We agreed to meet at an upscale restaurant downtown, the same place where Patricia had recorded their conversation about manipulating Grandma Rose's medication. The irony wasn't lost on me. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early and chose a table where I could watch the entrance. I had hidden a small recording device in my purse, and I was prepared to document whatever Victoria said. I also wore an outfit that made me look particularly vulnerable, a soft pink dress that Victoria had once criticized as too innocent. When Victoria arrived, she looked stunning as always. Her auburn hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a designer suit that I recognized from a high-end boutique. She kissed me on both cheeks, a gesture that felt like a betrayal in itself. "Ashley, you look lovely," she said, settling into her seat. "That dress is so sweet." The condescension in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. She was already positioning herself as the superior sister, the one who had moved beyond childish things like sweet dresses. We ordered our meals, and Victoria began what I now recognize as a carefully orchestrated conversation. She asked about my art, my marriage, and my relationship with Grandma Rose. Each question was designed to extract information that could be used against me. "How is Marcus doing?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "He seems stressed lately." "He's fine," I said, playing the innocent wife. "Just busy with work. You know how men are about their careers." Victoria nodded knowingly. "Oh, I definitely know how men are. They can be so focused on their goals, sometimes to the exclusion of everything else." There was something in her tone that made me wonder if she was having doubts about Marcus. Maybe the affair wasn't as perfect as they had planned. Maybe she was starting to realize that a man who would betray his wife might also betray his mistress. "How about you?" I asked. "Are you seeing anyone?" Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly. "I'm exploring my options. There are several interesting men in my life right now." Several? That was interesting. Either she was lying to throw me off, or she was keeping her options open in case things didn't work out with Marcus. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Victoria probing for information about Grandma Rose's health and my knowledge of her financial situation. She was skilled at making her questions seem natural, but I could see the calculated intelligence behind her casual inquiries. The most revealing moment came when she started talking about inheritance and family responsibility. "I've been thinking a lot about Grandma Rose's situation," Victoria said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "She's been so forgetful lately, and I worry that she might make decisions that aren't in her best interest." "What kind of decisions?" I asked, pretending to be concerned. "Well, you know how she's always been overly generous with her money. I'm worried that someone might take advantage of her condition to manipulate her into changing her will." The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Victoria was literally describing her own plan while positioning herself as the concerned granddaughter who was trying to protect Grandma Rose. Someone like who? I asked innocently. Victoria hesitated, and I could see her calculating how much to reveal. Well, there are people who might see her illness as an opportunity. Caregivers, advisors, even family members who might try to gain undue influence. Family members? I repeated, my voice filled with mock horror. I hate to say it, but yes, sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us the most. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Victoria was describing herself while making it sound like she was talking about someone else. What do you think we should do? I asked. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes bright with fake concern. I think we need to be more involved in Grandma Rose's care. Maybe we should consider getting power of attorney, just to make sure she's protected. There it was, the real reason for the lunch. Victoria was trying to manipulate me into supporting their plan to gain control of Grandma Rose's assets. She probably thought that if I agreed to the power of attorney, it would legitimize their actions and make it harder for anyone to challenge them later. That's a great idea, I said, playing along. Who do you think should handle that responsibility? Victoria tried to look modest. Well, I do work at a law firm, so I understand these things better than most people. That, and Marcus has a lot of experience with financial matters. Maybe we could work together to make sure Grandma Rose is properly cared for. I nodded enthusiastically. That sounds perfect. I'm sure Grandma Rose would be so grateful to have family members looking out for her interests. Victoria smiled, clearly thinking she had successfully manipulated me into supporting her plan. I'm so glad you agree, Ashley. Family has to stick together, especially during difficult times. After lunch, I walked Victoria to her car, keeping up the act of the naive, supportive sister. But as she drove away, I felt a surge of satisfaction. She had just confessed to her entire plan, and it was all recorded on the device in my purse. That evening, I met with Patricia to review the recording. She was impressed by how much Victoria had revealed. She's getting overconfident, Patricia said. That's good for us. Overconfident criminals make mistakes. Patricia had been busy gathering additional evidence. She had managed to access Marcus's business records and found even more evidence of embezzlement. The total amount he had stolen was approaching $500,000, spread across multiple client accounts and construction projects. He's been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, Patricia explained, using money from new clients to pay old debts, skimming from construction budgets, and falsifying invoices. When this comes out, he won't just lose his business. He'll be looking at serious federal charges. She had also discovered that Victoria had been using her position at the law firm to access confidential client information, which was a serious breach of legal ethics that could result in her disbarment. They're both facing career-ending consequences, Patricia said, but they're so focused on your grandmother's money that they can't see the walls closing in around them. The next week passed in a blur of secret meetings and careful planning. Grandma Rose's surgery was scheduled for Thursday, and the will reading was set for Friday afternoon. Harold Zimmerman had arranged for the reading to take place at his law office, and he had made sure that both Marcus and Victoria would be present. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday with Grandma Rose, helping her prepare for the surgery and making sure she was comfortable. Despite her illness, she was surprisingly calm and focused. She knew that the next few days would determine whether justice would be served or whether her manipulators would succeed in their scheme. "Are you ready for this?" she asked me on Wednesday evening. "I'm terrified," I admitted, "but I'm also angry, and I think anger might be stronger than fear." She smiled and squeezed my hand. Anger can be a powerful motivator as long as it's channeled in the right direction. Tomorrow, we channel it toward justice. Thursday morning arrived gray and rainy, which seemed appropriate for what was about to unfold. I drove Grandma Rose to the hospital for her surgery, and we spent the morning together in the pre-operative area. She was weak but determined, and I could see the fighting spirit that had carried her through 8 decades of life. "Whatever happens," she said as they wheeled her into surgery, "remember that you are stronger than you know." And remember that some battles are worth fighting, even when they're difficult. The surgery lasted 4 hours. I waited in the family lounge, pacing and worrying despite knowing that the surgery was routine. Marcus arrived halfway through, playing the role of the concerned son-in-law. "How are you holding up?" he asked, putting his arm around my shoulders. The touch made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to lean into him. "I'm scared," I said, which was true for many reasons. "She's going to be fine," Marcus said, his voice filled with fake comfort. "Your grandmother is tough. She's been through worse than this." I wondered if he was thinking about the stress and confusion he and Victoria had been causing her. Did he feel any guilt about manipulating a sick old woman? Or was he so focused on the money that he had convinced himself he was doing nothing wrong? Victoria arrived just as the surgeon was coming out to give us the update. The surgery had been successful, and Grandma Rose was stable. She would need to stay in the hospital for a few days, but her prognosis was good. "Thank God," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what I would do if something happened to her." The performance was masterful. If I hadn't known about her true motivations, I would have been moved by her apparent devotion to our grandmother. That evening, after visiting hours ended, Marcus and Victoria suggested we go out for dinner to celebrate Grandma Rose's successful surgery. I agreed, curious to see how they would behave now that they were so close to executing their plan. We went to an expensive steakhouse, the kind of place Marcus had been taking me to less frequently as his financial problems mounted. Throughout dinner, Marcus and Victoria were more animated than I had seen them in months. They were clearly excited about what they expected to happen at the will reading. "I think we should start planning for the future," Victoria said, raising her wine glass. "Tomorrow is going to be an important day for our family." "To family?" Marcus said, clinking his glass against hers and then mine. "To family," I echoed, thinking about the real meaning of the word. Family wasn't supposed to involve betrayal and manipulation. Family was supposed to be about love and support and protection. As we left the restaurant, Marcus and Victoria exchanged a look that I had learned to recognize. They were planning to spend the night together, probably celebrating their anticipated victory. The thought made me sick, but it also made me more determined to see their plan fail. Friday morning arrived bright and clear, as if the universe was clearing the stage for the drama that was about to unfold. I visited Grandma Rose in the hospital, and she was alert and ready for what was coming. "Today is the day," she said, her voice weak but determined. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I asked. "We could postpone the will reading until you're feeling stronger." "No," she said firmly. "I want to be there when their world falls apart. I want to see their faces when they realize they've been outmaneuvered." Harold Zimmerman arrived at noon to escort Grandma Rose to his office. She was discharged from the hospital against medical advice, but she was determined to be present for the will reading. Harold had arranged for a wheelchair and a private nurse to accompany her. The law office was in a prestigious building downtown, the kind of place that suggested serious money and serious consequences. Harold's conference room was elegant and intimidating, with dark wood paneling and leather chairs that had probably witnessed decades of family drama. Marcus and Victoria arrived together, which was a mistake that I filed away for later use. They were both dressed formally, as if they were attending a funeral instead of a will reading. In a way, they were. They were attending the funeral of their criminal ambitions. "Ashley," Victoria said, kissing me on both cheeks, "how are you holding up?" "I'm okay," I said, settling into a chair next to Grandma Rose. "Just worried about Grandma." Marcus took the seat across from me, and I noticed that he kept checking his phone. He seemed nervous, which was unusual for him. Maybe he was starting to worry that something might go wrong with their plan. Harold called the meeting to order at exactly 2 p.m. He was a distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had been practicing law for over 40 years, and he had seen every kind of family drama imaginable. "We're here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Rose Van Denther," Harold began, his voice formal and precise. "Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this is a legal proceeding, and everything said here today is being recorded. I noticed Marcus and Victoria exchange a quick glance. They were probably wondering why the reading was being recorded, but they were too focused on their anticipated victory to be seriously concerned. Harold opened the will and began reading. The first few sections were standard legal language, establishing Grandma Rose's mental competency and revoking all previous wills. Then came the specific bequests. To my beloved granddaughter, Ashley Vandenther, I leave my house and all of its contents, including my art collection and all personal effects. I felt tears spring to my eyes. The house was worth at least $800,000, and the art collection was probably worth even more. But the emotional value was priceless. It was the place where I had spent countless hours with Grandma Rose, learning about life and art and love. Marcus and Victoria looked pleased. They were probably calculating that the house and art collection represented a significant portion of the estate, which would make their share even more valuable. To my granddaughter, Victoria Vandenther, I leave the sum of $50,000 to be held in trust until she reaches the age of 40. Victoria's smile faltered. $50,000 was a nice sum, but it was far less than she had expected. And the trust provision meant she wouldn't have access to the money for several years. Harold continued reading, detailing smaller bequests to various charities and friends. Marcus was mentioned as receiving $25,000, which was generous for a son-in-law, but nowhere near what he had expected. Then came the big revelation. The remainder of my estate, including all financial accounts, investments, and business interests, totaling approximately $1.2 million, I leave to the Rose Vandenther Foundation for Emerging Artists to be established and administered by my granddaughter, Ashley Vandenther. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus and Victoria stared at Harold as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. This wasn't what they had expected at all. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Could you repeat that last part?" Harold repeated the bequest, his voice calm and professional. Victoria's face was turning red, and I could see her hands shaking with rage. "This can't be right," Marcus said, leaning forward in his chair. Rose was confused about her finances. She didn't understand the implications of what she was doing. "I can assure you that Mrs. Vandenther was fully competent when she executed this will," Harold said. "She met with me multiple times over the past 6 months to discuss her wishes, and she was very clear about her intentions. But she promised me—" Victoria began, then stopped herself. Harold raised an eyebrow. "She promised you what, Miss Vandenther?" Victoria realized she had almost revealed too much. She talked about leaving me more than this. She said family was important to her." "Family is important to Mrs. Vandenther," Harold said, looking directly at Victoria. "That's why she's leaving the bulk of her estate to the granddaughter who has never asked her for money, never tried to manipulate her, and never betrayed her trust." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She was beginning to realize that her plan had failed, but she didn't yet understand how completely she had been outmaneuvered. "There must be another will," Marcus said, his voice desperate. "Rose was planning to make changes. She told us she was going to revise her estate plan." Harold smiled, and I saw a hint of the satisfaction that comes from delivering justice. "As a matter of fact, there is another document. Mrs. Vandenther asked me to read it after the will." He pulled out a second folder, and I felt my pulse quicken. This was it, the moment when Marcus and Victoria would learn the true consequences of their actions. "This is a codicil to the will," Harold said, "executed just 2 weeks ago. It contains what Mrs. Vandenther called an integrity clause." Marcus and Victoria looked confused. They had no idea what was coming. Harold began reading the codicil, his voice growing stronger with each word. "If any beneficiary of this will is found to have engaged in fraud, elder abuse, manipulation, or any other criminal activity related to this estate or to the testator personally, they shall be immediately and completely disinherited from this will and all other estate planning documents." The blood drained from Victoria's face. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. But Harold wasn't finished. "Furthermore, any person who violates the integrity clause shall be liable for all legal costs and damages incurred by the estate and shall be required to make full restitution for any financial harm caused to the testator or the estate." "What? What does that mean? Victoria whispered. Harold looked directly at her, his eyes cold and unforgiving. It means that if you or anyone else has been manipulating, defrauding, or abusing Mrs. Vandenthere, you will lose everything. Not only will you receive nothing from the estate, but you will be personally liable for damages that could amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. You can't prove anything. Harold smiled again, and this time there was no warmth in it at all. Actually, we can prove quite a lot. Mrs. Vandenthere has been working with investigators for months, documenting every instance of manipulation, fraud, and abuse. He opened a third folder, this one thick with photographs, documents, and transcripts. We have evidence of your affair, evidence of your embezzlement from your construction company, evidence of your conspiracy to defraud Mrs. Vandenthere, and evidence of your attempts to manipulate her medication and mental state. Victoria made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Marcus sat back down heavily, his face gray with shock. We also have recordings of your conversations, Harold continued, including detailed discussions of your plans to steal from Mrs. Vandenthere and your callous discussions of accelerating her death. The room was spinning. Marcus and Victoria had been so focused on their perfect plan that they had never considered the possibility that they were being watched and recorded. This is entrapment, Marcus said weakly. You can't use illegally obtained evidence. Everything we have was obtained legally, Harold said. Mrs. Vandenthere had every right to investigate people who were trying to defraud her. Private investigators, recording devices in her own home, financial audits of her own accounts, all perfectly legal. Grandma Rose spoke for the first time since the reading began. Her voice was weak but clear. Did you really think I was too old and sick to notice what you were doing? Did you think I would just let you steal from me and hurt my granddaughter? Victoria burst into tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and frustration. She had been so close to her goal, and now it was all slipping away. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. I needed that money. I have debts, obligations. I was counting on my inheritance. You were counting on money that was never yours, Grandma Rose said. You were counting on stealing from me while I was dying. Marcus tried a different approach. Rose, we can work this out. There's been a misunderstanding. Maybe we all got a little carried away, but we can fix this. The only thing that's going to be fixed, Harold said, is the damage you've done. Mrs. Vandenthere will be pressing charges for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Mr. Vandenthere, the district attorney, will also be interested in your embezzlement activities. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in. They weren't just losing their anticipated inheritance, they were facing serious criminal charges that could result in years in prison. And there's one more thing, Harold said, pulling out a final document. Mrs. Vandenthere has filed for a restraining order against both of you. You are not to contact her, visit her, or attempt to communicate with her in any way. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. Victoria stood up, her face twisted with rage. This isn't over, she said, looking directly at me. You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll contest this will. I'll prove that she was manipulated. Harold laughed, a sound that was both amused and contemptuous. Please do. Every legal challenge you make will be more evidence of your attempts to defraud the estate. And remember, under the integrity clause, you'll be personally liable for all legal costs. The more you fight this, the more money you'll owe. Marcus grabbed Victoria's arm. We need to go, he said. We need to call a lawyer. As they headed for the door, Victoria turned back one more time. Ashley, how could you do this to your own sister? I stood up, and for the first time in months, I felt truly strong. You're not my sister, I said. Sisters don't betray each other. Sisters don't steal from dying grandmothers. Sisters don't destroy each other's lives for money. You're going to regret this, Victoria said, her voice full of venom. No, I said, my voice calm and steady. The only thing I regret is not seeing who you really were sooner. They left, and the conference room fell silent, except for the sound of Grandma Rose's labored breathing. Harold began packing up his documents, and I realized that my old life was officially over. Everything I had believed about my marriage, my family, and my place in the world had been a lie. But as I looked at Grandma Rose, I realized that not everything had been destroyed. The days following the will reading were both triumphant and devastating. I had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Marcus and Victoria might have lost their bid for Grandma Rose's inheritance, but they weren't going to disappear quietly into the night. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Within hours of leaving Harold's office, Victoria had contacted 3 different law firms, trying to find someone who would take her case on contingency. She was claiming that Grandma Rose had been manipulated by me, that I had poisoned her mind against her own family, and that the will was invalid due to undue influence. Marcus, meanwhile, was dealing with a different kind of crisis. Patricia's investigation had been thorough, and when the evidence of his embezzlement was turned over to the authorities, his construction company was immediately shut down. Federal investigators froze his accounts, and his business partners were threatening to sue him for damages. But the most immediate problem was that Marcus wasn't planning to leave our house voluntarily. When I returned home that evening, I found him waiting for me in the living room, drinking whiskey and staring at the fireplace. "We need to talk," he said without looking up. I stood in the doorway, keeping my distance. I had learned not to trust him, and I wasn't sure what he might do now that his world was collapsing. "There's nothing to talk about," I said. "I know what you did. I know about the affair, the embezzlement, the plan to steal from my grandmother. I know everything." He looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before, genuine desperation. "Ashley, you don't understand. I never meant for it to get this far. The affair with Victoria, it just happened. And the money problems, they started small. I thought I could fix everything before anyone got hurt." "By stealing from a dying old woman?" I asked, my voice cold. "By securing our future," he said, standing up. "That money was going to be yours anyway. I was just making sure we could access it when we needed it." The rationalization was breathtaking. Even now, with his crimes exposed and his life in ruins, Marcus was trying to convince himself that he had been acting in my best interests. "Get out," I said. "Get out of my house right now." "It's not your house," Marcus said, his voice turning ugly. "It's our house. We're married, remember? Community property." I pulled out my phone. "One call to Harold Zimmerman, and you'll be arrested for violating the restraining order. One call to the federal investigators, and you'll be in custody for embezzlement." "Do you really want to test me?" Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating his options. Finally, he walked to the door, but he paused before leaving. "This isn't over, Ashley. I'm going to fight the divorce. I'm going to fight the restraining order, and I'm going to make sure you don't get to keep everything while I lose everything." "You already lost everything," I said. "You lost it the moment you decided to betray me." He left, but I knew he would be back. Men like Marcus don't accept defeat easily, especially when they're facing financial ruin and criminal prosecution. I spent that night packing his belongings and changing all the locks. I also installed a security system and cameras around the property. If Marcus was going to try something desperate, I wanted to be ready. The next morning, I received a call from Patricia. She had been monitoring Marcus and Victoria's activities, and she had disturbing news. "They met with a lawyer last night," she said. "Someone with a reputation for taking difficult cases. They're planning to challenge the will, and they're also planning to file a lawsuit against you personally." "What kind of lawsuit?" I asked. "They're claiming that you manipulated your grandmother into changing her will, that you isolated her from her family, and that you're guilty of elder abuse. They're asking for damages of $2 million. The hypocrisy was staggering. Marcus and Victoria, who had actually been manipulating and abusing Grandma Rose, were now accusing me of the crimes they had committed. "Can they win?" I asked. "Not if we can help it," Patricia said, "but they can make your life very difficult in the meantime. Legal battles are expensive and time-consuming, even when you win." I realized that Marcus and Victoria had found their revenge. They couldn't steal Grandma Rose's inheritance, but they could try to destroy me financially and emotionally through the legal system. That afternoon, I visited Grandma Rose in the hospital. She was recovering well from her surgery, but she was tired and weak. When I told her about Marcus and Victoria's latest scheme, she became angry. "They're like parasites," she said, her voice filled with disgust. "They can't create anything themselves, so they try to destroy what others have built." "What should I do?" I asked. "You should fight," she said. "But you should also be smart about it. Harold has some ideas about how to handle this." Harold's ideas were brilliant and ruthless. Instead of simply defending against Marcus and Victoria's accusations, he suggested that we go on the offensive. "They're accusing you of elder abuse," he said. "But we have evidence that they're the ones who actually committed elder abuse. We're going to file a countersuit for malicious prosecution, and we're going to ask for punitive damages." Harold explained that malicious prosecution was a serious charge that could result in significant financial penalties. If we could prove that Marcus and Victoria's lawsuit was frivolous and motivated by spite, they could be ordered to pay not only our legal costs, but also additional damages for the harm they had caused. "More importantly," Harold said, "we're going to make sure that their criminal trial happens as quickly as possible. Once they're convicted of elder abuse and fraud, their civil lawsuit will collapse." The criminal case moved faster than I expected. The federal prosecutors were eager to make an example of Marcus's embezzlement scheme, and the district attorney was equally motivated to prosecute the elder abuse case. Within 3 weeks, both Marcus and Victoria were arrested and charged with multiple felonies. The arrests made the local news, and the story spread quickly through our social circles. Marcus's business reputation was destroyed overnight, and Victoria was fired from her law firm. The partners couldn't risk being associated with someone who had been charged with elder abuse and fraud. But the public humiliation was just the beginning. The financial consequences were devastating. Marcus's assets were frozen, while investigators tried to trace the money he had stolen. Victoria's legal fees were mounting, and she was forced to sell her condo to pay for her defense. Meanwhile, I was moving forward with my new life. The Rose Van Denther Foundation for Emerging Artists was officially established, and I was working with Harold to create grant programs and scholarship opportunities. The foundation would support young artists who were struggling to establish their careers, just as I had been before my grandmother's inheritance changed everything. The foundation gave me a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. I wasn't just creating art for my own satisfaction. I was helping other artists achieve their dreams. It was a legacy that would honor Grandma Rose's memory and make a real difference in the world. I also began working on a new series of paintings that reflected my journey from betrayal to empowerment. The paintings were darker and more complex than my previous work, but they also had a strength and intensity that attracted serious collectors. My gallery owner was amazed by the transformation in my art. "Whatever you've been through," she said, "it's made you a much more powerful artist. These paintings have a depth and emotional resonance that your earlier work lacked." The success of my new paintings was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that I had survived the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged stronger than before. The criminal trials began 6 months after the arrests. Marcus was tried first, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The federal prosecutors had traced over $600,000 in stolen funds, and they had records of his attempts to hide the money in offshore accounts. Marcus's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been under extreme stress and had made poor decisions, but the jury wasn't sympathetic. The evidence showed that Marcus had been systematically stealing from his clients for over 2 years, and his attempts to manipulate Grandma Rose's will demonstrated a pattern of calculated fraud. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and Marcus was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $600,000 plus interest and penalties. Since he had no assets left to seize, the restitution order was essentially a life sentence of debt. Victoria's trial was more complex because her crimes were more subtle. The elder abuse charges were based on her attempts to manipulate Grandma Rose's medication and mental state, while the fraud charges were based on her conspiracy with Marcus to steal the inheritance. Victoria's defense attorney tried to argue that she had been manipulated by Marcus, that she was a victim of his schemes rather than a co-conspirator. But the recordings of their conversations undermined this defense. The jury could hear Victoria's voice as she bragged about confusing Grandma Rose and discussed ways to accelerate her death. The most damaging evidence was a recording Patricia had made of Victoria talking about me. In the recording, Victoria described me as pathetically naive and said that I deserved to lose everything, because I had always been Grandma Rose's favorite. Ashley thinks she's so special because she's an artist, Victoria said on the recording. But she's just a spoiled brat who's never had to work for anything. When we get the inheritance, she'll finally understand what it's like to struggle. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and Victoria was convicted on all charges. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution of $200,000. She was also disbarred, which meant she could never practice law again. The civil lawsuit that Marcus and Victoria had filed against me was dismissed as soon as their criminal convictions were final. Harold filed our countersuit for malicious prosecution, and we were awarded $500,000 in damages plus legal fees. The money was symbolic rather than practical. Neither Marcus nor Victoria had any assets left to pay the judgment. But the legal victory was important for establishing that their accusations against me had been false and malicious. Grandma Rose lived to see both Marcus and Victoria convicted and sentenced. She died peacefully in her sleep 3 months later, surrounded by family and friends who truly loved her. Her funeral was a celebration of her life and her legacy, and the Rose Van Denther Foundation was there to ensure that her memory would continue to inspire and support young artists for generations to come. As I stood at her graveside, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I had been a naive young woman who believed in love and trust and family. I had been weak and vulnerable, easy prey for predators like Marcus and Victoria. But Grandma Rose had taught me that strength doesn't come from avoiding betrayal. It comes from surviving it and learning from it. She had shown me that justice is possible, even when the system seems stacked against you. Most importantly, she had shown me that love is real and powerful, even when it's surrounded by hatred and greed. The Rose Van Denther Foundation flourished over the following years. We awarded grants to hundreds of young artists, helping them pursue their dreams and develop their talents. We also established a scholarship program that provided financial support to art students who might not otherwise be able to afford their education. I continued to paint, and my work evolved to reflect my journey from innocence to wisdom. The paintings were sought after by collectors who recognized the authentic emotion and hard-won insight they contained. I had several successful solo exhibitions, and my work was featured in major museums. But the most satisfying aspect of my new life was the knowledge that I had turned my pain into purpose. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had instead become the foundation for something meaningful and lasting. 5 years after the trials, I received a letter from Victoria. She had been released from prison after serving her full sentence, and she was working as a cashier at a grocery store. The letter was full of self-pity and blame, claiming that she had been unfairly punished and that I should forgive her because we were family. I threw the letter away without finishing it. Victoria still didn't understand that family isn't about blood, it's about loyalty and love and respect. She had forfeited her right to be called my sister when she chose greed over love. Marcus was still in federal prison, with 3 more years left on his sentence. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that he was working in the prison library and claiming to be writing a book about his experiences. I doubted that anyone would be interested in reading the self-serving rationalizations of a convicted embezzler and elder abuser. As I stood in my art studio on the 5th anniversary of Grandma Rose's death, I looked at the latest painting I had completed. It was a portrait of her in her garden, surrounded by roses and bathed in golden light. But there was something else in the painting, a shadow in the background that suggested the presence of those who had tried to harm her. The painting was called The Watchers, and it captured the truth that Grandma Rose had taught me. Evil people may think they're clever, but they're always being watched. Justice may be delayed, but it's never denied. And sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and helping others do the same. I thought about Marcus and Victoria, living with the consequences of their choices. They had lost everything: their freedom, their reputations, their futures. But more than that, they had lost the opportunity to be part of something beautiful and meaningful. The Rose Van Denther Foundation had now helped over 1,000 young artists launch their careers. The scholarship program had enabled hundreds of students to pursue their dreams. The community programs had brought art to underserved neighborhoods and schools. All of this had been possible because Grandma Rose had been wise enough to see through their deceptions and strong enough to fight back. She had turned their greed into an opportunity to create something that would outlast all of us. As the sun set over the city, I made a decision. It was time to write my own book, not about betrayal and revenge, but about resilience and redemption. I would tell the story of how love had triumphed over greed, how wisdom had defeated deception, and how one old woman's courage had changed the world. The book would be dedicated to Grandma Rose, and all proceeds would go to the foundation that bore her name. It would be another way to turn pain into purpose, to transform a story of betrayal into a story of hope. I picked up my pen and began to write. My name is Ashley Van Denther, and this is the story of how I learned that some secrets are worth more than money, and why the dead sometimes get the last laugh. The story was just beginning, but I knew how it would end. It would end with justice, with love, and with the knowledge that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up destroying themselves. And sometimes, that's the sweetest revenge of all.